Hi, it's Natasha N.K.O. It's Wednesday, 12th of August, 1801. Continuing to read on from People of the Lie, chapter 5. This is the third subsection of chapter 5. It's called Aspects of Diagnosis and Treatment, page 216. The two persons whose exorcism I witnessed were dramatically different people. One was hypomanic and intermittently psychotic before the procedure. The other was neurotically depressed, but eminently sane. One was of very average intelligence, the other of very superior intelligence. One was a loving parent, one an abusive parent. The one who looked sicker had the easier exorcism. The one who looked more sane had the deeper possession and the more ghastly struggle for healing. There was a unique flavour to each of their personalities. But some aspects of their possession and exorcism were strikingly similar. I am going to speak now throughout this subsection about these similarities, because they may serve as guidelines in the understanding of the nature of possession and exorcism. I can do so, however, only with the caveat that two cases do not a science make, and one should not expect a case to conform to such guidelines. From both these cases, I would conclude that possession is no accident. I very much doubt that somebody can go walking down the street one day and have a demon jump out from behind a bush and penetrate him. Possession appears to be a gradual process in which the possessed person repeatedly sells out for one reason or another. The primary reason both these patients sold out seems to be loneliness. Each was terribly lonely, and each, early in the process, adopted the demonic as a kind of imaginary companion. But there was also secondary reasons involved, reasons that I suspect might be primary in other cases. In one patient, the process seemed to begin with involvement in the occult at the age of 12. There's a note here. The note says, "It seems clear from the literature on possession that the majority of cases have had involvement with the occult, a frequency far greater than might be expected in the general population. It is difficult to discern which comes first, the occult involvement or the possession. I do not mean to imply that most people who involve themselves with the occult will become possessed, but they do seem to increase their chances. The traditional church has spoken of the danger of the occult as far back as its literature goes. From the beginning, the traditional church has recognized the reality that certain human beings could have supernatural powers, such as ESP or prophetic ability. It labeled such powers charisms or gifts. By this word gift, the church implies that such powers should be given to humans by God at a time and for a purpose of God's own choosing. When one involves oneself in the occult, wittingly or unwittingly, one is attempting to obtain, maintain, or enhance such power for one's own purposes. This the church calls magic. Practitioners of the occult often also refer to it as magic, but they distinguish between white magic and black magic. White magicians decry black magicians for practicing their art for malevolent motives, but feel comfortable with their own practice because they are convinced of their loving motives. But it is very easy to be self-deceptive about one's motives. So as far as the church is concerned, magic is magic and all of it is black, or potentially so. End of note. In the other process, apparently, the process apparently began at the age of 5 with something more ghastly than what one would ordinarily consider occult. Possession in both cases seemed to create what psychiatrists call fixation at the age of its onset. During the exorcism, one patient, when the healthy self was free to speak, gave the most poignant expression of fixation I have ever heard. I haven't learned anything these past 20 years. I'm really just 12 years old. How can I possibly function after the exorcism? I'm way too young to be married and have children. How can I have sex and be a parent when I'm only 12? After the exorcism, the other patient, whose possession began at 5, had to deal in intensive psychotherapy with all manner of 5-year-old fears, misconceptions, issues, and transferences. Both patients were highly predisposed to their possession by multiple stresses before and after the onset of their possession. Both were victims of human evil as well as demonic evil. In particular, while both had been supported by the traditional church in some minor ways, each had been deeply hurt in major ways by evil people under the guise or auspices of the church. Just as possession is a process, exorcism is also a process. In fact, exorcism begins not only long before the exorcism proper, but even before the patient is first seen by the exorcist. Psychotherapists should understand this. Usually, the biggest step in the healing process in ordinary cases occurs when a client first decides to see a psychotherapist. In such situations, people have already identified themselves as ill and have made the decision to work against their illness and to enlist professional help in that work. At some point, both these patients decided to fight back against the possession. Friendly though it had seemed at first, they had eventually concluded that the demonic within them did not have their best interests in mind, and so the struggle began. Indeed, it is probably only because of that struggle that the possession ever comes to light. It is because there is a struggle going on between an intact human soul and the infesting demonic energy that Martin correctly states that all cases of what we call possession ought more properly be referred to as partial possession or imperfect possession. The diagnosis of possession is not an easy one to make. Neither of these two cases had bulging eyes or demonstrated any clearly supernatural phenomena before the exorcism proper. Both showed multiple manifestations of routine mental illness, such as depression or hysteria or loosening of associations. Authorities who encounter cases often like to ask, is a patient possessed or is he or she mentally ill? It is not a valid question. As far as I can currently understand these matters, there has to be a significant emotional problem for the possession to occur in the first place. Then the possession itself will both enhance that problem and create new ones. The proper question is a patient just mentally ill, or is he or she mentally ill and possessed? My first case was a patient who had originally gone to another psychiatrist to be treated for an actual complaint of possession. The psychiatrist, unusually skilled, open-minded and caring, did not believe this self-diagnosis and repeatedly attempted to treat the case with drugs or psychotherapy without any success. It should be noted that this very wise man was most helpful to the patient later, both before and after the exorcism, even after I had been called into the case a year later. I spent 4 hours with the patient before I had the first subtle inkling that something might be going on beyond standard psychopathology. My second case had been in fairly intense analytical-oriented psychotherapy with an unusually experienced, spiritually-oriented woman for over a year and a half before the therapist even began to suspect that possession might be involved. It was the therapist in this case who first raised the issue. Indeed, the therapist believes it is precisely because of the gains that the patient made in psychotherapy that the possession began to be revealed. The time from the beginning of the specific evaluation of the issue of possession until the exorcism proper was 6 months in one case and 9 months in the other. In each case, the diagnosis was made not on the basis of a single finding, but on a whole conglomeration and pattern of many findings over time. In both cases, the major distinction in differential diagnosis was between possession and multiple personality disorder. In these cases, there were 2 distinguishing features. In multiple personality disorder, the core personality is virtually always unaware of the existence of the secondary personalities, at least until close to the very end of prolonged, successful treatment. In other words, a true dissociation exists. In these 2 cases, however, both patients were either aware from the beginning or were readily made aware not only of the self-destructive part of them, but also that this part had a distinct and alien personality. Not that they were not confused by this secondary personality. To the contrary, It quickly became clear that the secondary personality desired to confuse them. In many ways, the secondary personality seemed like a personified resistance. The second differentiation is that while in multiple personality disorders, the secondary personality may play the role of the whore, or the aggressive one, or the independent one, or someone with other unacknowledged traits. It has never been reported to my knowledge as being frankly evil. In both these cases, before exorcism, the secondary personality was revealed to be blatantly evil. A crucial part in this diagnostic uncovering process was an attempted deliverance. Deliverance is a sort of mini-exorcism, frequently conducted over the past 2 decades by charismatic Christians to treat people suffering from oppression, defined as a sort of halfway state between demonic temptation, which the charismatics would say we all undergo, and frank possession. There's a note. The note reads, "There is a good deal of controversy over these matters of oppression and deliverance. Many charismatics practice deliverance in cases in which I would find no evidence of demonic involvement. Indeed, they will attempt to cast out such things as spirit of alcoholism, spirit of depression, or spirit of revenge. They report many instances of dramatic success, yet some of us wonder how long-lasting such cures are, how many failed cases go unreported, and whether these almost casual and generally untrained interventions may not frequently be actually harmful. There is no way of knowing until the work of deliverance practitioners can be scientifically evaluated. For the present, I still must pay some heed to one of my mentors who believes that oppression is a false category, that there is either possession or not, and that there is either an exorcism or not. In his words, the charismatics generally are not dealing with true demons, but occasionally they catch a real fish." End of note. Something now must be said of the utmost importance. While both these patients demonstrated blatantly evil secondary personalities, they were not evil people. I never experienced either of them as evil. Unlike Charlene, they did not feel evil to me. Although I said that Charlene might have been a candidate for exorcism, it is likely she would not have been. I suspect that even if I had been able to tease apart her healthy from her sick self, I might have found her secondary personality to be the healthy one, and her core personality to be evil. I'm not sure that exorcism can be conducted with such a configuration. But in these cases, it was very different. Not only did the core personality of each seem healthy, it seemed unusually good and potentially saintly. In fact, I admired both of these people very much even before the exorcisms. As I have indicated, they came to exorcism precisely because they had struggled against their possession for some years. A mature psychiatrist team member said, following one of the exorcisms, "I have never seen a person of such courage. Indeed, I have reason to suspect that the potential holiness of these 2 people was one of the reasons for their possession. More will be said about this later." Martin has labelled the first and usually longest stage of an exorcism the pretense. My experience confirms this. What he meant by the pretense is that the demonic hides within and behind the person. For the exorcism to occur, the pretense must be broken. The demonic must be uncovered and brought into the open. Martin did not, however, comment upon the process nature of exorcism. The overriding question during the lengthy evaluation of both these patients was, is this person truly possessed? To answer this question and proceed to the exorcism proper, the pretense must be at least partially penetrated. The crucial aspect of the evaluation period is that partial penetration. It is not the only aspect. During the evaluation, the core personality needs to be both educated and encouraged. The encouragement is particularly necessary toward the end, because it is my impression from these 2 cases that as the exorcism proper approaches, the demonic activity heats up and the patient's experience sees considerable torment. One of the many risks of exorcism is that one cannot go into the exorcism proper with absolute, total certainty about the diagnosis of possession. In fact, one should not go into it with total certainty, for the exorcism proper is the final stripping away of the pretense, so as to come face to face with the demonic. I would never want to see that done by someone without the support of a loving, well-prepared team, as well as a large amount of scheduled time and careful planning. One of these patients had to be restrained for 2 hours during the exorcism proper. The other required almost continuous restraint for more than a day. The situation is analogous to performing major brain surgery for a suspected tumour. The surgery should not be attempted unless one is pretty sure that the tumour is there, but one cannot often be absolutely certain of what will be found until the skull flap is lifted away and the surgery has begun. So my advice would be to proceed as people proceeded in these 2 cases. Evaluate slowly and painstakingly up to the point at which the diagnosis of possession is 95% certain, but do not attempt to go beyond that point before the commencement of the exorcism proper. Once the exorcism proper was begun, with appropriate prayer and ritual, in both these cases silence seemed the most effective of the many means used for the final penetration of the pretense. The team would speak either with the patient's healthy core personality or the demon or demons, but would refuse to speak with some unclear mixture of the two. It took some time before the team in each case became adept at doing this, for the demon itself seemed to have a marked ability to draw the exorcist or team into confusing conversation that went nowhere. But as the team became more perceptive and steadfastly refused to be sucked in, both these patients began to alternate between a progressively more healthy appearing core personality and a progressively more ugly secondary personality, until suddenly the secondary personality took on inhuman features and the pretense was broken. As a hard-headed scientist, which I assume myself to be, I can explain 95% of what went on in these 2 cases by traditional psychiatric dynamics. For instance, the effectiveness of the aforementioned silent treatment requires no demons for explanation, perhaps particularly because they were lonely people, thirsting for relationships. The technique encouraged the appearance of separate selves which could be related with, and hence the necessity to choose between these selves. In regard to the possession, I could talk in terms of splitting and psychic introjects, and in regard to the exorcisms, I could talk in terms of brainwashing, deprogramming, reprogramming, catharsis, marathon group therapy, and identification. But I am left with a critical 5% I cannot explain in such ways. I am left with the supernatural, or better yet, subnatural. I am left with what Martin called the presence. When the demonic finally spoke clearly in one case, an expression appeared on the patient's face that could be described only as satanic. It was an incredibly contemptuous grin of utter hostile malevolence. I have spent many hours before a mirror trying to imitate it without the slightest success. I have seen that expression only one other time in my life, for a few fleeting seconds on the face of the other patient, late in the evaluation period. Yet, when the demonic finally revealed itself in the exorcism of this other patient, it was with a still more ghastly expression. The patient suddenly resembled a writhing snake of great strength, viciously attempting to bite the team members. More frightening than the writhing body, however, was the face. The eyes were hooded with lazy reptilian torpor, except when the reptile darted out in attack, at which moment the eyes would open wide with blazing hatred. Despite these frequent darting moments, what upset me the most was the extraordinary sense of a 50-million-year-old heaviness I received from this serpentine being. It caused me to despair of the success of the exorcism. Almost all the team members at both exorcisms were convinced they were at these times in the presence of something absolutely alien and inhuman. The end of each exorcism proper was signalled by the departure of this presence from the patient and the room. The critical moment of the exorcism is what Martin calls the expulsion. It cannot be rushed. In both the exorcisms I witnessed, it was initially attempted prematurely. I cannot fully explain what happens at this moment, but I can state that the role of the exorcist in this moment is the least important. Is the least important. The desperate prayers of the team are more important. These prayers are for God or Christ to come to the rescue, and each time I had a sense that God did just that. As I said earlier, it is God that does the exorcising. But let me amend that. Human free will is basic. It takes precedence over healing. At the moment of expulsion, both these patients voluntarily took the crucifix, held it to their chests, and prayed for deliverance. Both chose that moment to cast their lots with God. Ultimately, it is the patient herself or himself who is the exorcist. I do not want to denigrate the man. I've never heard of a female exorcist, but I have no reason to believe that there shouldn't be one, and quickly. Who is the designated exorcist? I want only to put his power in perspective. In truth, the role of exorcist is a heroic one, but the essence of the role is not any magical power at the time of expulsion. It is the gentleness and caring and patience and discernment and willingness to suffer with which he shepherds the whole exorcism process from beginning to end. It is upon his shoulders alone that the final decision rests as to whether or not the patient is truly possessed, and whether to proceed with the massive undertaking of the exorcism proper. It is he who must gather the team together, discerning who would fit and who would not. It is he who prepares both patient and team as best he can, nurturing their trust and understanding. It is he who makes crucial decisions about timing and direction during the course of the exorcism proper. It is he who must bear the fullest pain of the clash with the demonic, just as it is he who must bear the responsibility if the exorcism fails. And last, it is he who must pick up the pieces after the exorcism proper, dealing not only with the emotional reactions of all the team members, but supervising the patient during the extremely critical period when he or she is utterly vulnerable and requires intense care before being finally led to safety. Both patients of whom I have been speaking required at least 2 hours a day of psychotherapy for some weeks following the exorcism proper. It is a draining time. Satan does not easily let go. After its expulsion, it seems to hang around, desperately trying to get back in. In fact, in both cases, it very much looked for a short while as if the exorcism proper had failed. The patients had returned largely to their pre-exorcism condition. Nonetheless, within a few hours it was possible to discern a subtle but extraordinary change. All the old complexes were back in place, but it was as if the energy had gone out of them. The change was that now these patients could listen, and what they heard could now have an effect. In one case, psychotherapy became possible for the first time. In the other, more was accomplished in 50 hours of intense psychotherapy following exorcism proper than in 500 hours preceding it. These patients moved extraordinarily fast. It was as if they were catching up for all those lost years. But perhaps because it moved so fast, it was tumultuous therapy, making great demands on the therapist. I feel it important to warn others that my experience of Satan demonstrates that it does not easily let go. Satan will not only tell the patient it is still around, but in one case repeatedly misled the patient into believing that it was still inside. In these cases, perhaps the greatest and most diabolic of all temptations for both patient and exorcist was to believe that the exorcism proper had been a failure when in fact it had been a success. It seemed as if the exorcism proper moved the patients from a position of demonic possession to what has been called demonic attack. The tempting, threatening, and frightening voices that each heard were at least as active afterward as before. But as one patient said, before it was like I was a little embryo, totally surrounded and hidden by them so that I could not be me. Now I am me, and while I still hear the voices, they're coming from outside of me. Or as the other said, before the voices were in control of me, now I'm in control of them. The voices only very gradually faded away for these patients, but what was not gradual was their improvement. Given the severity of their psychopathology before their exorcisms, the rapidity of their progress to health is not explainable in terms of what we know about the ordinary psychotherapeutic process. The teams deserve some additional mention. Each member of both came not nearly so much out of curiosity as out of love. Each, as well as the exorcist, was there at considerable personal risk and sacrifice. Consider, for instance, those 2 team members who offered their houses for the exorcisms. If one begins to hunt for a place to hold an exorcism, other than a patient's house, which was unfeasible in each of these cases, one begins to realise the full meaning of the expression, "there was no room in the inn." Psychiatric hospitals don't currently want exorcisms going on in their midst, nor do convents or monasteries. So it was up to 2 brave people in these cases to step forth not only with their bodies, but with their homes. I have said that the presence of God was virtually palpable in the room. I do not think this was an accident. I suspect that whenever 7 to 10 people gather together at personal risk, motivated by love and healing, God will be there, as his Son assured us he would, and that healing will occur. I mentioned that the primary reason each of these patients had originally sold out to the demonic was from loneliness. They were not only lonely people, but were accustomed to being lonely. And when they came to exorcism, each was still basically a loner. Their courage in doing so may be all the more apparent when it is realized that neither was basically a trusting person. A major reason that the team was crucial in each exorcism was that the team gave the patient their very first experience of a true community. There's a note. The note reads, "Within Christian circles, a great deal is spoken these days of Christian community. But a group of nominal Christians does not a Christian community make. On the other hand, despite the fact that some team members were self-defined atheists, or admittedly lukewarm Christians, there is no doubt in my mind that at each exorcism the team assembled was a true Christian community." End of note. There is no doubt in my mind that this experience was an essential factor in the success of both exorcisms. Many skills were required in each of these battles with the demonic: analytic detachment, compassionate involvement, intellectual formulation, intuitive insight, spiritual discernment, deep understanding of theology, thorough knowledge of psychiatry, great experience with prayer, and others. No one person can possess all these skills. I suppose in easier exorcisms, the team may be needed only to restrain the patient. But in those of which I'm speaking, while the exorcist was the coordinator in charge, a true team approach was absolutely necessary. The talents of all team members were used. I also had a sense in both exorcisms that our weaknesses and mistakes were being used as well. It is said that Christ can use even our sins. I have spoken of the presence of God in those rooms. It may sound mystical, but when I reflected on each event, it seemed as if God or Christ had been choreographing the whole show. The most common reaction of team members following the completion of these exorcisms was expressed by one woman when she said, "I never want to go through anything like that again, but I wouldn't have missed it for the world." Strangely, the exorcisms were healing not only for the patients, but for a number of the team members as well. Another team member, a man, 2 weeks afterward reported, "You don't know this, but I've always had a small, cold, hard place in my heart. It's gone now, and I find I have become a better therapist. In fact, even some of the people who were not at the exorcisms, but were praying for their success, seemed to experience a certain healing. Mystically, again, I have an incoherent sense that these exorcisms were not just isolated events, but somehow almost cosmic happenings. Still, it is the patients who served as the very centre and focal point of these happenings. I salute them. Through the torment and courage of their struggle with Satan, they won a great victory, not only for themselves, but for many. I'll stop there because there's a whole heap of stuff in there. Page 229. I'll record another ramblings where I share my thoughts on what I've read. Thank you for listening.